My name is Evelyn Hart. I'm 70 years old, and if you'd told me 6 months ago that I'd be sitting across from my only son in a paneled law office in downtown Boston, waiting for the reading of my ex-husband's will, I would have laughed. Not the kind of laugh that comes from joy, but the kind that carries the weight of disbelief. We hadn't spoken much in the last 20 years. Not really. The occasional email, a stiff Christmas card, but nothing close to the warmth we once shared when he was a boy. Yet here we were, mother and son, seated across a polished mahogany table, facing a man in a charcoal suit with silver hair and round spectacles who looked like he'd been the messenger of many unwelcome surprises in his career. Michael sat to my right. His suit was sharp, his tie a deep burgundy that looked expensive enough to need its own insurance policy. The glint of his cufflinks caught the afternoon light spilling in from the tall window behind the lawyer. His lips curled into something between a smirk and a warning. Leaning slightly toward me, he spoke just loud enough for me to hear. "You do know you're wasting your time, right? Dad made sure you'd get nothing. You walked out, remember? Don't expect a cent." I didn't answer. I'd learned decades ago that there's more power in silence than in any clever retort. Instead, I kept my gaze on the lawyer, Thomas Avery, who was busy arranging the papers in front of him, tapping them twice against the desk until they aligned into a perfect stack. He looked up, met my eyes briefly, and said in a tone that was neither smug nor sympathetic, "Mrs. Hart, you may want to stay for this." Something about the way he said it made me shift slightly in my seat. But I kept my hands folded in my lap, exactly where they'd been since I'd walked into that room 10 minutes earlier. The truth was, I hadn't planned on coming. When the letter from Avery and Cole, attorneys at law, arrived in my mailbox, I let it sit on the counter for 2 days. I assumed it was a mistake. Why would Daniel Hart, my ex-husband of 27 years, have anything to leave me? We hadn't spoken since the day I packed my old Chevy, buckled Michael, then 11, into the passenger seat and drove away from the clapboard house we'd once called ours. Daniel went on to become a name people dropped at business luncheons. He built a real estate empire that stretched from Cape Cod to the Florida Keys. I went on to become the woman people whispered about in grocery store aisles, the first Mrs. Hart. So why was I here? I'm not sure. Curiosity, maybe. Or something harder to admit. A need to see, with my own eyes, the world I'd been erased from. The office smelled faintly of leather and lemon polish, the kind of scent that clings to places where time moves slower for the wealthy. Outside the window, the brick facades of Beacon Hill glowed under the weak winter sun. Inside, the only sound was the soft scrape of Mr. Avery's fountain pen against paper. Michael was restless. He scrolled through his phone, then set it down with an exaggerated sigh. He was 38 now, but in that moment, I saw the same impatient tilt of his chin he'd had as a teenager, when he was starting to measure his life against his father's instead of mine. When we left Daniel all those years ago, I didn't have much. Just the Chevy, 2 suitcases of clothes, and a savings account that wouldn't have covered a month's rent in Boston. We moved into a cramped second-floor apartment above a bakery in Worcester. The walls were thin, and every morning at 4 a.m., the scent of rising dough would drift into our living room. I found work as a night cashier at a 24-hour pharmacy. The hours were brutal, the pay barely enough to keep us afloat. But for a while, Michael and I were close. He liked comic books and grilled cheese sandwiches cut into triangles. On Sundays, we'd walk to the library, and he'd pile books so high in his arms I could barely see his face. I thought, naively, that this was enough, that love and loyalty could hold us steady. Then the gifts started arriving. At first, they were small. A pair of brand-name sneakers, a new backpack for school. But soon they became bigger ski trips in Vermont, a laptop, his first car at 16. They all came from Daniel, accompanied by promises of time together that usually meant long weekends in glossy condos. Every time Michael came back, there was a little more distance in his eyes. He started noticing the peeling paint on our window frames, the fact that our TV wasn't a flat screen. By 18, he had moved in with his father full-time. I didn't fight it. I didn't beg. I just told him to call me if he needed anything. The calls came less and less, until they stopped altogether. So, sitting here now, across from a man who looked more like a stranger than the boy I'd once carried on my hip, I wasn't expecting kindness. Or anything at all. From Daniel's will. Avery cleared his throat. This is the last will and testament of Daniel Joseph Hart, signed and notarized January 14th of this year. Michael leaned back, arms crossed, ready for confirmation of whatever windfall he'd already calculated in his mind. To my son, Michael James Hart, Mr. Avery read, I leave the Nantucket property, including all furnishings, and a transfer of 400,000 from my investment account, contingent upon his continued service as CEO of Hart & Co. For no less than 3 years following my death. Michael's posture shifted. The easy confidence flickered. That wasn't the plan, he said sharply. I can only read what's written, Mr. Avery replied. He turned the page. To my former wife, Evelyn Grace Hart. The air in the room changed. Michael straightened in his seat. I leave controlling interest. Minus 50, 1% ownership, in Hart & Co., with full voting rights and board authority. I also leave her the townhouse at 1 and 14 Willow Street in Boston, and $35 million in liquid assets held in trust under her name since 2002. Silence. My hand stayed still in my lap, but I felt the blood rush to my ears. Michael's eyes snapped toward me, sharp and accusing. This has to be a mistake, he said. Avery shook his head. Your father anticipated your reaction. He left a recorded statement. He pulled a small tablet from his briefcase, tapped the screen, and there was Daniel. Older, thinner, his once perfect hair now streaked with gray. He was wearing a black sweater instead of his usual suit. If you're watching this, he began, means I'm gone, and everything has been delivered as I intended. His gaze shifted to me. Evelyn, I never told you how much I owed you. You stood by me when I had nothing but a leaky roof and a borrowed desk. When I lost myself chasing more, you carried our son. I can't give you back those years, but I can at least give you the recognition you deserved. He turned to the camera, as if looking directly at Michael. You've been given every opportunity, but there's a difference between building something and inheriting it. This isn't about punishment, it's about setting things right. The screen went dark. No one moved. For the first time in a long while, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel around my son steady. Michael was the first to break the silence. You manipulated him, he said, his voice low but edged like broken glass. I didn't flinch. I haven't spoken to your father in over 20 years. That doesn't mean you didn't find a way in at the end. He pressed. His cheeks had flushed a deep red, and the vein above his temple was visible now. Mr. Avery intervened calmly. Mr. Hart, your father's will was prepared under full legal and medical advisement. 2 physicians attested to his mental capacity, and the documents were reviewed multiple times over the past 3 years. But Michael wasn't listening. His eyes stayed locked on me. You're just the woman who left him. You walked out on him. On me. I met his gaze. I left a man who no longer played music. The words came out before I had time to soften them, but they were the truth. Daniel had been many things, a dreamer, a hustler, a man who could turn a handshake into a deal. But once, long before the houses and the summer homes, he used to sit at a weathered oak desk in the evenings and sketch out blueprints for renovations we'd never afford. He used to hum while sanding old window frames, play the guitar by the fireplace, laugh when I tried to sing along. Somewhere along the way, those moments vanished. And so did we. Michael opened his mouth, then shut it again. Mr. Avery slid a manila envelope toward me. Mrs. Hart, there's a key inside. It belongs to the townhouse on Willow Street. I suggest you inspect it when you're ready. There's also a sealed letter from Mr. Hart. He asked that it be given to you personally. The paper felt heavier than it should. I didn't open it there. Some things deserved space, away from the eyes of people waiting to measure your reaction. We wrapped up the meeting without further words between Michael and me. He gathered his tablet, muttered something about lawyers making a fortune on this circus, and walked out. The door closed behind him with a sharp finality. 3 days later, I stood outside 114 Willow Street. The townhouse was taller than I remembered, though maybe it was just my memory that had shrunk. The brick was the color of warm rust. The shutters painted a deep green. Snow from last night's storm clung to the edges of the steps. I unlocked the door. The scent hit me first, not the mustiness of neglect, but something warm and deliberate. Sandalwood, faint vanilla, and underneath it all, the unmistakable trace of polished wood. Inside, the place was staged for the market. Neutral colors, perfectly placed throw pillows, a kitchen so pristine it looked like it had never been cooked in. But the bones were still the same. The creak in the second stair, the sunlight that always fell in slanted gold lines across the front room in the late afternoon. I walked slowly, my fingertips grazing the edges of door frames, as if the past might rise from the grain of the wood. Then I found it. In what used to be Daniel's small study, a space barely big enough for a desk and a bookshelf, there was a covered shape against the wall. I pulled the cloth back and stopped breathing. It wasn't the guitar I'd expected. It was the drafting table. The same battered oak table Daniel bought from a salvage yard in our first year of marriage. One leg had always been shorter, and he fixed it by wedging an old paperback underneath. The same paperback was still there, its spine cracked and faded. On the table was a small envelope with my name written in his familiar blocky handwriting. I opened it slowly. Evelyn, if you're reading this, you came back. I kept this table all these years, even when I had no use for it. You were there when I was still sketching ideas I wasn't sure would ever work. You believed in the bones of things. Maybe that's why I'm giving you the company. You might still know how to keep the foundation sound. If you ever find a reason to draw again, the tools are in the bottom drawer. It wasn't a love letter, but it was acknowledgement, and in some ways, that was harder to come by. I left the townhouse that evening without deciding whether I'd keep it, sell it, or let it sit empty for a while. I just knew I needed time, not for the money, not even for the company, but for the truth that had been missing for so long. When I stepped back out onto Willow Street, the air was sharp and cold, and the city moved around me as if nothing in the world had changed. But for me, something had. For decades, I thought the absence of an apology meant the absence of recognition. But sometimes, the truth arrives in quieter ways: a letter in familiar handwriting, an old drafting table, the weight of a key in your palm. It doesn't erase the years, but it changes their shape. If you've ever carried the feeling that you were erased from your own story, remember this: your part of the truth still matters. And one day, it may find its way back to you. If this story reminds you of something buried deep, share it in the comments. Like the video, subscribe, and maybe, just maybe, your story will help someone else find their way back to their own page. I didn't have to wait long for Michael's next move. 5 days after I stepped out of the townhouse on Willow Street, I received a thick envelope from a Boston law firm I'd never heard of. The return address read, Hastings and Monroe, embossed in gold lettering. Inside was a polite but unmistakably sharp letter: Mrs. Hart, please be advised that our client, Mr. Michael J. Hart, is seeking a formal review of the last will and testament of the late Daniel J. Hart, citing concerns over undue influence and lack of direct involvement in company matters by the beneficiary. I set the letter down on my kitchen counter and stared at it for a long time. Not because I was shocked. This was exactly the kind of move Daniel would have predicted. He'd always said, if you corner Michael, he'll try to buy his way out. But this wasn't about money. This was about erasing me. Again, I called Mr. Avery that afternoon. He was calm, reassuring, and almost amused. Mrs. Hart, he said, your ex-husband anticipated this. Every asset transfer, every clause in that will, was reviewed and signed off by independent counsel. Michael can try to drag this out, but unless he can prove coercion, which would be impossible, he doesn't have a case. Impossible, I repeated. That's not a word I'd use for Michael. He's persistent. That's why. Mr. Avery replied, you should be prepared for persistence to become hostility. I didn't sleep much that week. Not because I was afraid of losing the company, but because every time I closed my eyes, I was back in the early days, before Hart & Co. was even a name. Daniel and I had been newly married, living in a one-bedroom rental above a bakery in Somerville. He'd come home from his construction job covered in sawdust, drop his tool belt by the door, and start sketching at the drafting table he'd later leave for me. He had this wild idea of starting his own restoration business, taking run-down brownstones and making them beautiful again. At first, I thought it was just talk. But then the calls started coming in, small jobs, then bigger ones. I kept the books, answered the phone, chased down laden voices. We worked out of our kitchen for 2 years, living on black coffee and whatever bread the bakery downstairs would give us at the end of the day. I was there when we signed our first real contract, when we maxed out our only credit card to buy materials, when Daniel nearly gave up after a client refused to pay. Hart & Co. wasn't just his, it was ours. And I had walked away not because I stopped believing in the company, but because somewhere along the way, Daniel had stopped believing in us. 2 weeks after Michael's letter arrived, I got a call from him directly. No assistants, no lawyers, just his voice on the other end. "I don't want this to get ugly," he began. "You sent me a threat through a law firm," I said evenly. "I'd say it's already ugly." A pause. Then, "You don't know how to run Hart & Co. Mom, you've been out of it for decades. You'll tank everything Dad built. The board already thinks you're a liability." I let his words hang in the air before answering. "If your father didn't trust me to handle it, he wouldn't have given me the voting rights. This isn't about trust. It's about capability," he shot back. "I'm willing to buy you out, cleanly, quickly, and for more than the shares are worth." There it was. The deal always a deal. "I'm not selling," I said. Silence, then colder. "Then I'll see you in court." After the call, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, the letter from Hastings, and Monroe still lying in the center like a quiet dare. I knew if I fought him, it wouldn't just be about contracts and clauses. It would be about 30 years of history neither of us had ever said out loud. That night, I opened the bottom drawer of the drafting table. Inside were Daniel's old tools, T-squares, pencils worn down to stubs, a stack of yellowed graph paper. But under the paper was something I didn't expect: a black leather notebook, the kind Daniel used for site notes. When I flipped it open, the first page stopped me cold. "Hart & Co. is nothing without Evelyn. She sees the bones before I see the walls." The rest of the notebook was filled with sketches and notes from the first years of the company. My handwriting was in the margins. Reminders to send invoices, lists of materials, even grocery lists mixed in with blueprint dimensions. It wasn't proof in a legal sense, but it was proof of something deeper. For the first time in years, I thought, maybe I won't just defend what Daniel left me. Maybe I'll run it. Sometimes the fight isn't about what you stand to gain. It's about reclaiming what was taken without anyone noticing. Michael thinks this is about a company. It's not. It's about the truth of who built it, and who gets to keep that truth alive. If you've ever had someone try to write you out of your own story, don't let them hold the pen. Share your thoughts in the comments, like the video and subscribe, because some battles are worth fighting not for the win, but for the record. The first sign that Michael had gone public came in the form of a headline. I was standing in line at a coffee shop near the Boston Common when I saw it on the morning news feed playing silently above the counter. Hart and CO. Board N2 scrolls F2 if. Underneath was a photo of me, one I didn't recognize, walking out of Mr. Avery's office, clutching my coat against the wind. Michael's image was right beside mine, looking every bit the polished executive, the kind of man you'd trust with your life savings. The Chiron beneath him read, "Current CEO warns company at risk." By the time I reached home, my phone had exploded. Calls from numbers I didn't know, emails from reporters, even a voicemail from an old neighbor telling me I was all over the news. Michael hadn't wasted time. He'd called an emergency board meeting without me, and in his statement to the press, he'd painted me as an absentee figure with no corporate experience in the last quarter century. He used phrases like legacy at stake and fiduciary responsibility, words meant to make his case sound noble rather than personal. I wasn't Nalam. He was laying the groundwork to push me out before I even sat in a boardroom chair. The next day, I received a call from a number with no caller ID. Normally, I'd let it go to voicemail, but something told me to answer. "Evelyn Hart," a woman's voice asked. "Yes." "This is Claire Monroe. I worked with Daniel in the early days of Hart & Co." I paused, trying to place the name. "I was his first project manager," she continued. "If you have a few minutes, I think we should talk." We met that afternoon in a quiet booth at an old seafood restaurant in the North End. Claire was in her late 60s, with sharp blue eyes and the kind of handshake that still carried strength. "I saw the news," she began. "And I also know how much of that company has your fingerprints on it, whether the board wants to admit it or not." I raised an eyebrow. "You were there." "I was there when you kept the books on a folding table in your kitchen. I was there when you drove Daniel to client meetings because the van broke down. You think he did that alone? He didn't." She reached into her bag and pulled out a thin folder. Inside were photocopies of old invoices, contracts, and even pay stubs from those first years. My name was on nearly all of them, listed as co-signer, contact, or project lead. I kept these after I left, Claire said. Daniel hated paperwork, but I always kept a second copy for myself. You're going to need them if Michael keeps coming after you. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the folder spread out before me. I remembered those days vividly, nights when I'd sit with a calculator, trying to stretch 50D into enough to cover materials and groceries. Seeing it all in black and white was strange, like looking at an old photograph of yourself and realizing you'd forgotten the shape of your own face. I called Mr. Avery the next morning and told him about Claire. "Bring me everything she gave you," he said. "If the board tries to challenge your authority, this will remind them you're not some stranger who wandered in. You're part of the foundation." 2 days later, I walked into my first board meeting as the controlling vote. Michael was at the head of the long conference table, flanked by 6 members who'd clearly been prepped to view me as an obstacle. His opening remarks were polished, measured, and aimed entirely at convincing the board that my role should be purely symbolic. When it was my turn, I didn't match his tone. I didn't have to. I slid Claire's folder across the table. Before Hart & Co. had a headquarters, I began, before there was a board, before we had more than a single rusty van and a stack of unpaid invoices, there was me and Daniel. And there was this. The room was silent as the board members flipped through the documents. Dates, signatures, proof. Michael's jaw tightened. He knew exactly what it meant. I wasn't going anywhere. Sometimes the past you thought was forgotten is still sitting in a box somewhere, waiting for the right moment to matter again. Michael wanted to rewrite the origin story of Hart & Co., but the truth has its own way of resurfacing, quiet, undeniable, and stronger than anyone expects. If you've ever had someone try to erase your part in something you helped build, tell your story. The right people will listen. And sometimes, the proof is closer than you think. The first rumor reached me through an old friend, not the news. I was having tea with Margaret, my neighbor for the past 15 years, when she leaned across the table and lowered her voice. "Evelyn, I don't know if you've seen it yet, but Michael's people are saying things." I frowned. "What things?" "That you left Daniel because you were having an affair. That you mismanaged the company's early funds. That the only reason you got anything in the will is because you threatened to go public with secrets." It took me a moment to absorb the words. The air between us felt heavier. "That's not just business," Margaret added quietly. "That's a smear campaign." 2 hours later, I found the first article. The headline was the kind you couldn't ignore. Questions raised about Evelyn Hart's past as Hart & Co. Control battle heats up. The piece quoted unnamed sources close to the family, accusing me of everything from marital betrayal to shady bookkeeping. There were no facts, just speculation, carefully planted to stick like burrs in the public mind. I knew exactly what Michael was doing. If he couldn't beat me in the boardroom, he'd try to make me toxic outside it. I called Mr. Avery that evening. "Can we sue for defamation?" "You could," he said, "but proving malice in a case like this is hard. And Michael will hide behind anonymous sources. The better approach is to get ahead of it." "How?" "Show them you have nothing to hide. And find allies who will say it for you, not just you saying it yourself." That's when I thought of Claire again. And of someone else I hadn't spoken to in years. Samuel Price. Samuel had been Daniel's lead architect for almost a decade before the company went public. He was known for being brutally honest, both in design and in conversation. More importantly, Samuel had seen the marriage from the inside. The nights Daniel came home angry because I'd questioned a risky deal. The mornings I was in the office before the first crew arrived. I called him. He answered on the second ring. "Evelyn," he said, sounding mildly surprised. "Been a long time. I need a favor," I said simply. "I figured," he replied, but his tone wasn't unkind. We met the next morning at a quiet cafe in Back Bay. I told him everything, about the will, Michael's challenge, and the smear campaign. Samuel listened without interrupting, his fingers drumming lightly on the table. When I finished, he leaned back. "You know, I walked away from Hart & Co. because Daniel stopped listening to anyone but himself. But I always knew you were the one keeping the ground steady under his feet. Michael's good at image, but he's not a builder. If you want to show people the truth, I'll stand beside you." 2 days later, Samuel and Claire joined me at a press conference outside the Hart & Co. headquarters. The media had been waiting for blood, but what they got instead was testimony. Claire spoke about the early years, about my role in keeping the company afloat when a single missed payment could have sunk us. Samuel talked about my eye for structure, how I'd once stopped a renovation mid-project because I spotted a foundation crack no one else had noticed. When it was my turn, I didn't defend myself against the rumors. I didn't need to. "I'm not here to fight over my past," I told the cameras. "I'm here to protect the company I helped build from becoming nothing more than a brand without a backbone." Hart & Co. was founded on more than profits. It was built on care for the craft. If we forget that, it doesn't matter who sits at the head of the table. We'll have already lost. The coverage the next day was mixed, but for the first time, it wasn't Michael controlling the narrative. And that, I realized, was the beginning of my leverage. When people can't win against your truth, they'll try to make you look too dirty to be worth believing. But the thing about mud is, it washes off. The foundation underneath stays. If you've ever had to defend your name against lies, remember the truth is stubborn. And sometimes, the best way to protect it is to let others speak what you've lived. It didn't take Michael long to hit back. 3 days after our press conference, I woke up to the kind of headline that makes your stomach drop before you even finish reading it. Former Hart & Co. employees accused of misconduct. Allegations surface against key allies of Evelyn Hart. The article named both Claire and Samuel. Claire was accused of mishandling early renovation contracts back in the 90s. Contracts she swore had been signed off by Daniel himself. Samuel was painted as a problem employee who'd been dismissed for insubordination, omitting the part where he resigned voluntarily after refusing to cut safety corners. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. Michael's fingerprints were all over it. I called Claire first. She answered on the second ring, her voice tight. "His dredging up paperwork from 30 years ago," she said, twisting it to fit his story. "I can prove it's false, but proving it in public, that's another matter." Samuel was calmer, almost resigned. "I knew he'd come after me. I'm not worried about myself. I'm worried about how this makes you look." The board meeting that week felt different before it even began. When I walked into the glass-walled conference room, Michael was already there, shaking hands, leaning in close to whisper to board members. The air was thick with the unspoken, accusations hanging like smoke. Once we sat down, Michael opened with a statement that could have come straight from a political campaign. "In light of recent revelations about Mrs. Hart's chosen advisors, I believe it is in the company's best interest to limit her voting rights until these matters are resolved." It was a surgical strike, calm, reasonable, sounding, and designed to undermine me without appearing openly hostile. I let him finish. Then I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a thin stack of papers, sliding them across the table toward each board member. "Those revelations," I said, "are based on selective records, missing context, and in some cases, outright falsehoods. What you have in front of you are the full documents, every signature, every approval, including Daniel's. Read them carefully, and you'll see exactly how much of this company's foundation was built by people you're being asked to distrust." Michael's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected me to come armed with proof so quickly. Then I did something I hadn't planned. I stood. "If my presence here is going to be used as a wedge to fracture this board, I'll make you an offer. I'll temporarily step back from day-to-day decision-making, but only if the board agrees to an independent review of the company's current operations under Michael's leadership." The room went still. Michael's eyes narrowed. He knew exactly what I was doing, shifting the scrutiny from my allies to him. An independent review would open every ledger, every contract, every internal deal he'd made in the last 5 years. Board members glanced at one another. A few were already leaning toward the idea. After a long silence, the chairman cleared his throat. Motion seconded. Vote will be held at the next session. Outside, Michael caught up to me before I reached the elevators. "You think you're clever," he said. "No," I replied, pressing the call button. "I think I've been underestimated for too long." The doors slid open, and I stepped inside without waiting for him to respond. Sometimes winning isn't about holding your ground. It's about knowing when to step sideways and let your opponent walk straight into the light. Michael wanted the spotlight on my past. Soon, it might be shining on his present. If you've ever been forced into a corner, remember, you don't always have to push back in the same direction. Sometimes you move just enough for the truth to come through on its own. The independent review began quietly. No press releases, no grand announcements. Just a small team of auditors slipping in and out of Hart & Co.'s headquarters like shadows. I'd been through enough corporate storms to know the real damage doesn't happen in public. It happens in sealed rooms with spreadsheets and contracts spread across the table. Within a week, whispers started trickling back to me. A payment to a shell company in Delaware with no discernible purpose. A renovation project in Chicago where the costs had ballooned by 40% without explanation. And then there was the quarterly report, signed by Michael, that had quietly overstated profits by just enough to keep shareholders happy. It was the kind of paper trail Daniel used to warn about. You can hide the truth for a while, Evie, he once told me, but the numbers always find their way home. One afternoon, as I was leaving a board subcommittee meeting, a man I barely knew, Jonathan Reed, one of the quieter board members, fell into step beside me. He was in his early 70s, the kind of man who still wore cufflinks to every meeting, but kept his opinions close. "Mrs. Hart," he said in a low voice, "I need 10 minutes of your time." "Not here." We walked to a coffee shop 3 blocks away. Jonathan didn't waste time. "I've seen enough of the preliminary findings to know Michael is in trouble. But if this explodes in the wrong way, the stock will tank, and the board will be forced to act quickly. Maybe too quickly for you to gain full control." I studied him. "And what do you suggest?" He leaned in. "I can get you the votes you need to remove him cleanly, with minimal public mess. But I'll want something in return, chairmanship of the audit committee for the next 2 years." It was a calculated move. He was offering me a shortcut, but shortcuts always came with a price. "Why?" I asked. Jonathan's lips curved into a dry smile. "Let's just say I've been waiting for Michael to hang himself, and I'd prefer to be holding the scissors when he does." That night, I sat at my kitchen table with Jonathan's business card in front of me. On one hand, accepting his offer meant I could end this faster, before Michael had the chance to launch another smear campaign. On the other, it meant tying myself to a man whose loyalty was clearly as strategic as it was fragile. I thought about Daniel's drafting table, about the notebook hidden in the drawer, about how the company was built on risks we'd taken together, not on backroom deals. But then I thought about Michael's face in the last board meeting. Confident, certain he could outmaneuver me, and I realized I didn't have to like Jonathan to use what he was offering. The next morning, I called him. "You'll have your committee seat," I said, "but I want the vote before the next quarterly report is due. We do this cleanly, or not at all." Jonathan chuckled. "Mrs. Hart, I like your style. Sometimes the people you need most aren't the ones you trust. They're the ones whose interests happen to run parallel to yours, for just long enough to get the job done. The key is knowing when to shake their hand and when to let go. If you've ever had to make a deal with someone you wouldn't invite into your own home, share your story. Because in the real world, alliances are rarely about friendship. They're about timing." The boardroom was colder than usual that morning. Maybe it was just me, but I swear the air felt thinner. Like we were about to step into a fight that would leave bruises, even if no one raised a hand. Jonathan was already seated near the head of the table, his cufflinks catching the light as he shuffled papers. Across from him, Michael leaned back in his chair, arms folded, wearing that particular brand of calm that only shows up when someone thinks they've already won. The chairman cleared his throat. "We are here today to vote on a motion to remove Michael J. Hart from the position of CEO of Hart & Co., effective immediately, pending the results of the independent review." Jonathan nodded toward me. A silent cue. The votes were lined up, just as we'd planned. But before the chairman could call the roll, Michael spoke. "I have an announcement," he said smoothly, sliding a folder across the table. "Hart & Co. has secured a preliminary agreement with a major investor, an infusion that would increase our market cap by 15% within the quarter. The catch." He glanced at me. "The investor will only proceed if I remain as CEO." Murmurs rippled through the room. It was a clever play. Link his survival to the company's immediate gain. Board members who'd been ready to vote him out were suddenly staring at the folder like it was a lifeline. Jonathan shot me a look, his jaw tight. This wasn't part of the plan. I let the noise die down before I spoke. Interesting timing, I said, keeping my voice even. Considering the investor's due diligence can't possibly be complete while the independent review is still underway. Michael smiled. You'd be surprised how quickly deals can close when the right people are involved. I could feel the momentum shifting, the certainty we'd built over weeks starting to slip. This was exactly what he wanted, to make the board hesitate, to buy himself time. That's when I decided to use the card I'd been holding since the day Claire gave me that folder. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a single document, a photocopy from Daniel's old notebook, notarized by Mr. Avery for authenticity. I slid it into the center of the table. This, I said, is from the founding records of Hart & Co. It's Daniel's handwriting. It details the company's first partnership agreement and includes a clause that has never been rescinded. One of the board members, a corporate attorney by training, leaned forward to read. His eyes widened. It says here, he said slowly, that any CEO found to have engaged in financial misrepresentation, regardless of profit to the company, is to be removed immediately, with all voting rights suspended pending investigation. I looked directly at Michael. The independent review has already uncovered 3 instances of questionable reporting under your leadership. I haven't shared the details publicly yet, but if this board wants to pretend that clause doesn't exist, I'll have no choice. The room went still. Even Jonathan didn't move. Michael's confident posture faltered for the first time. You're bluffing, he said. I shook my head. Check the founding documents yourself. You'll find Daniel's signature on every page. The chairman cleared his throat again. Given this new information, the vote will be postponed 1 week to allow review of the clause and the preliminary findings. It wasn't the removal I wanted, but it wasn't a loss either. As we filed out, Jonathan leaned close enough for only me to hear. You just made it impossible for him to move without stepping into his own trap. I smiled faintly. That was the idea. Sometimes the key to winning isn't to strike fast. It's to make sure your opponent's next move leads them straight into the rule they can't bend. Michael bought himself a week. But in that week, the truth will only grow sharper. If you've ever had someone try to stall you with a last-minute trick, tell me in the comments. Because timing may be everything, but leverage is forever. The boardroom felt different that morning. It wasn't just the cold air or the polished table. It was the way every chair seemed to hold someone already braced for a fight. Michael sat at the head of the table, posture loose but eyes alert, scanning the room as if he could measure each person's vote before they spoke. Jonathan was 2 seats to my right, hands folded neatly on the table. Across from me, Claire avoided Michael's gaze, her lips pressed into a thin line. The chairman opened the meeting. We are here to reconvene on the motion to remove Mr. Michael Hart as CEO of Hart & Co., pending the findings of the independent review. Michael raised his hand. Before we begin, I'd like to reiterate that our investor deal is still on the table, but only if stability is maintained. It was the same tactic as last time, tying his job to the company's short-term gain. But this time I was ready. I slid a single folder toward the center of the table. This, I said, is the preliminary report on the Chicago renovation project. I've received it from the independent auditors as part of my board oversight role. It contains evidence of unauthorized expense inflation totaling over $1.2 million, and all of it approved under Michael's digital signature. Michael leaned forward. That's a lie. I looked him in the eye. Then you'll have no problem explaining why the system logs show an attempt to delete those files from within your office last week, using your credentials. A murmur ran through the board. Jonathan didn't say a word, but I saw the corner of his mouth twitch. The chairman adjusted his glasses. Mr. Hart, do you deny this? Michael hesitated. A fraction too long. I delegate tasks. It could have been an assistant. Or, I said evenly, it could have been you. Trying to make sure the board never saw this before today. I stood, walking to the end of the table. Daniel built this company with the idea that if integrity was negotiable, the foundation would crack. We are standing on that crack right now. The question is whether we fix it, or let it widen until the whole structure falls apart. The room went silent. The chairman cleared his throat. We will proceed to vote. All in favor of removing Michael Hart as CEO, effective immediately, and appointing interim leadership, please raise your hand. One by one, hands went up. Jonathan's was first. Claire's followed. Even two of Michael's long-time allies hesitated, then lifted their hands. When the count was finished, the result was clear. 8-3. Michael sat back, pale but still holding his composure. You think this is the end? He said quietly. No, I replied. I think this is the beginning. Without you at the helm. The chairman announced the motion passed. Michael was removed, effective immediately. As I gathered my papers, I caught Jonathan's eye. He gave me a slight nod. Business concluded, alliance intact for now. Sometimes a fight drags on because both sides keep trading blows. But sometimes, all it takes is one strike in the right place at the right moment, and the entire balance shifts. If you've ever had to wait for exactly the right second to act, share your story in the comments. Because patience isn't weakness, it's the weapon no one sees coming. My first week as interim CEO of Hart & Co. felt less like taking over a company and more like walking into a building where someone had left the gas on. On paper, I had control, voting rights, board authority, and the chair at the head of the table. But behind the glossy quarterly reports and the neat presentations, the numbers told a different story. Jonathan was the one who called it what it was. These aren't just accounting errors, he said, sliding a file across my new desk. They're tripwires. Deliberate ones. The auditors had uncovered a series of financial commitments Michael had signed off on in his final months. Overpriced vendor contracts. Unprofitable acquisitions, even a land purchase in Nevada that served no strategic purpose. On their own, they were suspicious. Together, they looked like a sabotage blueprint. Why would he do this? I asked. Jonathan's mouth tightened. So that if you took over, you'd inherit a mess big enough to sink you. And then he could say you were never capable of running the company. The more I dug, the more I saw Daniel's warning in that old notebook coming to life. If integrity is negotiable, the foundation will crack. The foundation wasn't cracked. It was splintering. Fixing it would take months of brutal restructuring. Firing people loyal to Michael, renegotiating contracts he'd locked in, and possibly cutting projects the board considered untouchable. Claire came into my office late one night as I was buried in spreadsheets. You're looking at this like you have to save it, she said gently. I do, I replied. She shook her head. No, Evelyn. You have to decide if it's worth saving. There's a difference. Her words stayed with me long after she left. By the end of the second week, I had two clear paths in front of me. Path 1, keep Hart & Co., fight through the minefield Michael left, and try to restore the company to the vision Daniel had once had. Path 2, sell my shares while the market still believed in the brand, secure the trust Daniel had left for me, and walk away before the explosion went off. The board was split. Jonathan wanted me to keep control, but I could tell his reasons were as much about power as principle. Claire, on the other hand, leaned toward selling, arguing that the name Hart & Co. was already too stained to restore. I thought about the drafting table. The long nights in the kitchen when this company was just an idea sketched on cheap paper. The way Daniel used to talk about building something that would outlast us both. That night, I locked my office, took the elevator to the rooftop deck, and looked out over the city. Lights shimmered across the skyline, each one belonging to someone with their own battles, their own decisions no one else could make for them. And I realized whatever I chose, it had to be on my terms, not Michael's, not the board's, and not even Daniel's. Sometimes the hardest part of winning isn't beating the person in front of you. It's deciding what to do with the victory once you have it. Power can feel like a prize, but it's also a burden. And the moment you forget the difference is the moment you start building cracks into your own foundation. If you've ever stood at a crossroads where either path meant giving something up, share your story. Because some choices aren't about right or wrong. They're about what you're willing to carry. The offer came in a sleek black envelope. No email. No phone call. Just a hand-delivered packet to my office with the return address of one of the largest conglomerates in the country. Granite Peak Holdings. Inside was a formal letter from their CEO, Victoria Lane. She didn't waste words, Mrs. Hart. Granite Peak Holdings is prepared to acquire a controlling interest in Hart & Co. for a sum exceeding current market valuation by 18%. We will retain the Hart & Co. brand name, preserve 65% of the current workforce, and establish a founder's legacy program in your name. You would hold a ceremonial chair on the board and have final approval on all philanthropic initiatives. It was, on paper, a dream offer, money, legacy, a graceful exit that would let me keep a seat at the table without the day-to-day battles. But it also meant handing over the heart of the company to people who'd never sat at Daniel's drafting table, never patched together payroll by the skin of their teeth, never cared about the bones, the way we had. Jonathan came into my office an hour later, already holding a copy of the offer. "It's a good deal," he said flatly. "The kind you only see once. They've got the resources to fix the mess Michael left without gutting the brand." Claire's opinion was different. She leaned against my desk, arms folded. "They'll say they're keeping the name, but it won't be Hart & Co. anymore, not in the way that matters. It'll be a department inside a machine." I stayed silent. That night I went home and found myself staring at Daniel's old notebook again. There was one page I'd never paid much attention to before. Half finished, almost a doodle. It was a sketch of a building facade, rough lines and incomplete details. Underneath, Daniel had scrawled, "Not everything has to be finished by the same hands that start it." I read the sentence over and over. Was that permission to let go? Or just a note he'd written in passing, never knowing it would become a question I couldn't answer? The next morning, Victoria Lane herself called me. "I understand this is personal," she said, her voice calm, deliberate. "But I want you to know, if we do this, the Hart & Co. name will still mean something. It will stand for quality and integrity. Two things that don't belong to one person, but to everyone who believes in the work." I asked her for a week to decide. She agreed. 7 days. That was all I had to choose between staying in the fight or stepping aside. Between control and legacy. Between keeping my hands on the wheel and trusting someone else not to crash what Daniel and I had built. And for the first time since I'd walked back into this company, I wasn't sure which choice would feel like winning. Sometimes the hardest decision isn't between good and bad. It's between two versions of good that come with their own costs. Legacy can be protected in more than one way. But the weight of deciding how often falls on the one who's carried it the longest. If you've ever had to decide whether to hold on or hand over, share your story in the comments. Because letting go isn't always giving up, and holding on isn't always winning. By the 4th day of my week, long deadline to respond to Granite Peak Holdings, I'd convinced myself the only voices I'd be hearing were from Jonathan, Claire, and the ticking clock in my head. Then Michael walked into my office. No appointment, no warning. Just the sound of the door clicking shut behind him as he stepped inside, looking sharper than I'd seen him since the day the board voted him out. His suit was immaculate, his tie perfectly knotted, and in his eyes, I saw something I hadn't in months. Calculated restraint. "We need to talk," he said. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence hang. The same way I had in the law office months ago. "I know about Granite Peak's offer," he continued, "and I know you're considering it. And if I am," he stepped closer to my desk, "if you sell Hart & Co. becomes another division inside a conglomerate. The name might survive, but the soul won't. You know it, and so do I. That's why I'm here." I sat back wary. "You're here to save the company." A faint smile. "I'm here to make a deal. You and I split control, co-CEOs. You keep the brand's integrity. I bring in the investors who trust me, not some faceless boardroom in another city. Together, we keep Hart & Co. independent." It sounded, at first pass, almost reasonable, until he said the rest. "But there's one condition. You drop all internal investigations tied to my tenure, publicly. No findings, no reports, no lingering stains on my name." There it was. The price of independence, silence. I thought about the Chicago project, the inflated contracts, the shell companies. About Olivia Brooks calling me late at night to warn me someone had tried to erase evidence. About the clause in Daniel's founding documents that said integrity couldn't be negotiable. "If I do that," I said slowly, "I'm telling every person in this company that the truth is optional. That reputation matters more than accountability." Michael shrugged. "Sometimes that's just reality." "Reality," I said, "is what gets written down when everyone else looks the other way." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. Evelyn, this is bigger than you or me. If you take Granite Peak's offer, you're letting strangers gut the company. If you keep fighting me, you'll burn it down yourself. This is the middle ground. After he left, I stood by the window for a long time, watching the traffic move below like nothing had changed. But everything had. Because now the choice wasn't just between control and legacy. It was between telling the truth and keeping the company alive. And whichever way I went, someone would call it betrayal. Sometimes the real battle isn't about what you're fighting for. It's about what you're willing to give up to win. Michael was offering me the company's independence at the cost of its integrity. And the question that kept me awake that night wasn't, which is better? It was, which can I live with? If you've ever been forced to choose between the truth and the thing you've worked your whole life to protect, tell your story in the comments. Because the hardest choices are the ones that follow you long after the fight is over. I barely slept after Michael's visit. His offer kept looping in my mind. Not because I was tempted, but because he wasn't wrong about one thing: selling to Granite Peak meant the soul of Hart & Co. would become a line item in someone else's portfolio. I needed a third way, and I had less than 3 days to find it. The answer came, unexpectedly, from a voice I didn't recognize. Late the next afternoon, my assistant buzzed me. There's someone here asking for you. Says her name is Tessa Dangayan. Claims she used to work for Daniel. I frowned. When? She said before Hart & Co. was even Hart & Co. Curiosity outweighed caution. Send her in. Tessa was in her early 40s, wearing a simple navy coat and carrying a weathered leather satchel. She sat down across from me, folded her hands, and got straight to the point. I was Daniel's first outside investor, she said. Before he had a company, before he had your townhouse on Willow Street, I gave him 50,000 when he had nothing but blueprints and a stubborn streak. I blinked. Why have I never heard your name? Because Daniel and I had an agreement. I'd stay silent, let him build without interference, in exchange for a single condition: if Hart & Co. was ever at risk of being sold to a corporate conglomerate, I'd have the right to step in first. She slid a document across my desk, an original notarized agreement dated 1985. I can buy out a majority of the board's voting shares. She continued, and I have partners who share my vision, craftsmanship over profit. But I'll only do it if you agree to stay on as CEO for at least 2 years and restructure the company's leadership your way. It was, in many ways, exactly what I'd been looking for. An escape from Michael's leverage, a way to keep Granite Peak at bay, and a chance to protect the company's independence. But it also came with risk. Tessa's partners were a mystery, and while her intentions sounded noble, I'd seen enough shared vision. Deals collapse under the weight of competing agendas. I need to know, I said carefully, that you're not another version of Granite Peak in a smaller suit. Tessa smiled faintly. That's why my name's not on any corporate masthead. I don't need the control. I just need to know Hart & Co. will keep building the way it was meant to. That night, I called Claire and Jonathan into my townhouse. I laid out Tessa's offer. Jonathan was immediately skeptical. He hated unknown quantities. Claire, on the other hand, saw the opportunity. This is your out, she said. And it's the one that lets you keep both the name and the truth intact. As I sat there, the weight of the decision pressing down on me, I realized this was the moment Daniel's unfinished sketch had been pointing toward. Not everything has to be finished by the same hands that start it. Maybe Tessa and I weren't the same hands that built the first bricks of Hart & Co. But maybe we were the ones who could keep the cracks from spreading. Sometimes the path forward isn't the one you carve alone. It's the one you're willing to walk with someone you've never trusted before. The danger isn't in the risk itself. It's in thinking you can avoid risk entirely. If you've ever had to gamble on a stranger to save something you love, share your story. Because trust, when given at the right moment, can be the most dangerous weapon you have. 2 days before my deadline with Granite Peak, I invited Tessa back to the office to finalize the terms. She arrived with the same worn satchel, the same calm confidence. We went through the numbers, the transfer plan, the projected restructuring. Everything looked clean. Too clean. It was Jonathan who broke the rhythm. He'd been flipping through Tessa's 1985 agreement when he stopped cold. This signature here. he said, tapping the page. It's witnessed by a name I recognize. Elliot Kane. I felt a prickle at the base of my neck. Who's that? Jonathan's jaw tightened. Former acquisitions officer for Kingsley Group. The same Kingsley Group that tried to take Hart & Co. hostile in 1998. Tessa didn't flinch. Elliot and I worked together back then. Yes, Kingsley was aggressive. And yes, I was part of those talks. But I walked away when I saw how they treated the companies they bought. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, skeptical. Or you walked away because the deal fell through. Tessa met my eyes. You can believe whatever version you want. The truth is, I stayed out of the corporate machine for 20 years. I've had chances to cash in, and I didn't. I'm here now because I think you still care about the bones of this company, Evelyn, and so do I. That night, alone in my townhouse, I stared at Daniel's notebook. Open to that one unfinished sketch. Not everything has to be finished by the same hands that start it. Was Tessa the right pair of hands? Or was I about to trade one kind of control for another, more dangerous one? Claire called around midnight. You don't have to decide until the morning. But Evelyn, if you say no to Tessa and no to Granite Peak, Michael's going to find a way back in. He's already circling. It was true. If both deals collapsed, the board might start looking for stability. And Michael was a devil they already knew. The next morning, I called Tessa. I'll move forward, I said, but on my terms. No outside partners without my approval. And if I get even a whiff of Kingsley Group anywhere near this deal, I'll walk, publicly. There was a pause, then a quiet. Fair enough. Sometimes moving toward the end isn't about tying everything up neatly. It's about stepping onto the next stone, knowing it might shift under your feet. I didn't know if Tessa was the perfect choice. I only knew she wasn't Michael, and she wasn't Granite Peak. And maybe, in the end, that was enough. The deadline hit on a Tuesday morning. At 9:00 a.m., Granite Peak's legal team was scheduled to call, expecting my decision. Tessa was already in the building, ready to sign our agreement before I gave Granite Peak their answer. Jonathan and Claire were in my office, both tense for different reasons. Jonathan because he hated uncertainty, Claire because she knew the storm wasn't over. At 8037, the elevator doors opened. Michael walked in. He didn't look rattled. He looked like a man who'd been saving his last card for the perfect moment. You're about to make a mistake, he said, stepping toward my desk. Tessa isn't who you think she is. I didn't answer. He tossed a folder onto my desk. Inside were photocopied emails, recent ones, between Tessa and a senior advisor at Kingsley Group. Discussions about strategic alignment, long-term integration, and a line that made my stomach turn: acquisition of Hart & Co. Through existing equity transfer. Tessa's face didn't change. Those emails are from exploratory talks months ago. Before I came to you, I walked away. Michael smirked. Or maybe you came to her because Kingsley couldn't get me to sell. Jonathan swore under his breath. Claire leaned forward. Evelyn, we don't have time. Granite Peak will be on the line in 20 minutes. I looked at Tessa. If I ask for every single communication you've had with Kingsley since the day you walked away, will you give it to me? Yes, she said instantly. I turned to Michael. And if I don't sign with Granite Peak or Tessa, you'll come back to the board pitching yourself as the savior, won't you? He didn't bother to deny it. At least I'm not lying about who I am. The clock ticked louder in my head than it did on the wall. This was the moment, the one that would define whether Hart & Co. stayed alive, was sold, or crumbled under the weight of every bad decision in its history. I closed the folder and looked at all three of them. I'm not signing with Granite Peak, I said. And I'm not giving Tessa control. Michael's grin returned, too early. Instead, I continued. I'm restructuring the company into an employee-owned cooperative. The board will be dissolved. Voting shares will be distributed among the people who actually build this company's projects. I'll stay as CEO for 1 year to oversee the transition. Then step down. The room froze. Michael's voice sharpened. You can't just. Yes, I cut in. I can. Daniel's founding documents give the CEO full authority to restructure the company if it's in danger of collapse. And after everything both of you have pulled, I'd call this danger. Tessa's lips curved, not in victory, but in something like respect. That's bold. Bold is the only way this company survives without selling its soul, I said. At 900, I called Granite Peak. Thank you for the offer. I told them, but Hart & Co. isn't for sale. Not now, not ever. When I hung up, Michael was already halfway to the door. He didn't look back. Tessa stayed for a moment longer, then left without another word. It was just me, Jonathan, and Claire in the office. And for the first time since walking back into this company, I felt the air clear. Sometimes the ending isn't about winning over your rivals. It's about removing the board they're playing on. Michael wanted power. Tessa wanted position. I wanted the company to matter again. In the end, I realized the only way to keep the foundation from cracking was to put it in the hands of the people who'd never stop building. If you've ever had to burn down the old structure to save the home it holds, share your story in the comments. Because sometimes the real victory is knowing you left something standing that will outlast every name on the door. I didn't expect the silence after my decision to be so loud. For weeks, Hart & Co. had been a battlefield. Meetings, strategy calls, whispers in hallways, press clippings left anonymously on my desk. But once the announcement went public, that the company would transition into an employee-owned cooperative, the noise stopped. Not because everyone agreed, but because there was nothing left to fight over. Michael tried, of course. He issued a statement to the press calling my move reckless and a disservice to shareholders. But the truth was, most of the shareholders were gone, bought out at fair market value through a restructuring plan I'd pushed through in my final act as CEO. His voice carried less weight when the audience no longer had a stake in his return. Tessa didn't fight me either. She sent a short email the next day. You made the right call. And for what it's worth, Kingsley was never going to get me back in their pocket. I believed her. Or maybe I just wanted to. The transition wasn't easy. Turning a traditional company into a cooperative is like taking apart a house while still living in it. You can't stop using the kitchen just because you're replacing the foundation. We spent months rewriting governance policies, training department heads in financial transparency, and creating a voting system that gave every employee, from the senior architect to the youngest apprentice, a voice. There were mistakes, arguments, even moments when I wondered if Michael had been right about stability. But then there were the small signs. The project manager in Chicago, who told me she'd never felt trusted by leadership before. The design intern who proposed a new restoration method that saved the client thousands, then watched his coworkers vote unanimously to implement it. For the first time in decades, Hart & Co. wasn't just a name on the letterhead, it was people. And those people owned it. The boardroom was dismantled. Literally. The long polished table where so many battles had been fought was cut into sections and repurposed into desks for the new open floor design office. I kept one piece for myself, carved into the shape of a drafting triangle, and set it on my desk as a reminder of what we'd torn down to build something better. Jonathan stepped down quietly once his 2-year audit committee term ended. Claire stayed on, running project operations with the same sharp eye she'd always had. And me, I had 1 year, just as I'd promised, to shepherd the company through the change. The morning of my last day, I came in early. The office was quiet. Just the hum of the HVAC and the faint smell of fresh coffee from the communal kitchen. I went to my office, though I suppose it wasn't mine anymore, and opened the bottom drawer of the drafting table Daniel had left me. The notebook was still there. I flipped to the first page, then to the last. The final words in Daniel's handwriting were faint from age, but still clear. Build as if the hands after yours will care as much as you do. I closed the notebook, slid it back into the drawer, and locked it. At 9 a.m., the staff gathered in the main floor for what they thought would be a short farewell speech. I stood at the center of the room, surrounded by the people who now carried Hart & Co. into its next chapter. When I came back here, I thought my job was to protect a company from falling apart. What I didn't realize was that the company wasn't the name, or the building, or even the projects. It was you. And the best way to protect you wasn't to hold on to control, it was to give it to you. I saw heads nodding, a few smiles, 1 or 2 people wiping their eyes. This place will keep standing, I said, because you'll keep building. And my hope is that you'll build in a way that the hands after yours will thank you for. That's all any of us can do. I stepped back and the applause rose, not polite but warm. Real. I left the office without ceremony, carrying nothing but my coat and that small carved triangle from the old boardroom table. Outside, the winter air was crisp, the city loud and alive. I didn't look back, because for the first time in years, I didn't need to. We think the battles we fight are about winning, but sometimes they're about ending the fight in a way that leaves something worth keeping behind. Heart & Co. is no longer mine, and that's the point. It belongs to the people who show up every day to make something that will outlast all of us. If you've ever been faced with the choice to hold on or let go, remember, letting go doesn't mean you lose. It means you trust what you've built to stand without you. Sometimes holding on isn't strength, and letting go isn't weakness. The true measure of what you've built is whether it can stand without you. If this story moved you, share yours, because someone out there needs to hear it.